Imagine inheriting a powerful kingdom, built by generations of wise and courageous kings, and in one impulsive act, watching it shatter before your eyes. This is exactly what happened to Rehoboam, the son of Solomon and grandson of David, two of the greatest leaders in biblical history. He had everything: wealth, power, an unparalleled spiritual legacy, and the throne of Israel in his hands. But in one rash decision, he not only lost control of much of the kingdom, but also left a trail of division and instability that would echo for centuries. If you were in his place, would you have done differently? Or would you, like many of us, also succumb to pressure and pride? Rehoboam's story isn't just an ancient account. It's a mirror reflecting our own choices and their consequences. How often in our lives do we make impulsive decisions driven by the emotions of the moment without considering the long-term impact? How often do we prefer advice that confirms our desires rather than seeking the wisdom that challenges our ego? Rehoboam teaches us that the price of impulsiveness can be too high, and that pride can lead us to lose what we value most. But this story goes beyond a simple warning. It invites us to reflect on how we handle power, responsibility, and the expectations we inherit, whether at work, in our families, or in our communities. We all have our own throne to occupy. The question is, are we prepared to rule with wisdom, or are we destined to repeat Rehoboam's mistakes? And more importantly, what can we do today to ensure that our legacy is one of unity, not division? Get ready to dive into a narrative that blends power, betrayal, spirituality, and timeless lessons. Rehoboam's story isn't just about a king who divided Israel. It's about how our choices, no matter how small they may seem, can change the course of history. And in the end, it leaves us with a haunting question. What will be the impact of your decisions on the world around you? Rehoboam, the son of King Solomon and grandson of the legendary King David, was born into an environment of luxury and wisdom, surrounded by a royal legacy few could dream of. From an early age, he was raised in the halls of Rehoboam's palace, where wealth and knowledge flowed like a tranquil river. Imagine growing up in a place where the walls whispered tales of conquests and the gardens were adorned with the fruits of Solomon's wisdom. It was a world of gold, but also of colossal expectations. The weight of being the heir to the United Kingdom of Israel was not something to be carried lightly, and Rehoboam would soon realize this. The spiritual heritage left by David and Solomon was something Rehoboam carried in his blood. David, the man after God's own heart, and Solomon, the wisest king who ever lived, were figures that echoed in every decision he had to make. But between us, it's not always easy to follow in the footsteps of giants, is it? Imagine having to live up to a grandfather who defeated Goliath and a father who built the Temple of Jerusalem. The pressure was immense, and Rehoboam, still young, could hardly fathom the challenges that lay ahead. Life in the palace was a constant reminder that he was not just a prince, but the future guardian of the throne of Israel. While playing in the royal gardens, Rehoboam was taught about the laws, history, and faith of his people. But like any young man, he also had moments of doubt and rebellion. After all, who hasn't questioned the path laid out for them? The thing is, in Rehoboam's case, these doubts weren't just personal. They would affect an entire kingdom. The wisdom of Solomon was something Rehoboam admired, but also something he didn't quite know how to apply to his own life. He grew up hearing stories about how his father resolved complex disputes and ruled with justice. But did he have the same ability? The truth is, Rehoboam was about to discover that inheriting a throne is not the same as inheriting the wisdom to rule. And as we all know, theoretical knowledge doesn't always translate into practical actions. Meanwhile, the United Kingdom of Israel was beginning to show signs of tension. The northern tribes, weary of the heavy tributes imposed by Solomon, began to murmur. Rehoboam, still inexperienced, could hardly imagine that these murmurs would turn into a political earthquake. But, as the saying goes, those who don't heed advice will hear from the unfortunate. And Rehoboam was about to learn this lesson the hard way. Now, imagine yourself in Rehoboam's place. Young, full of expectations, but also uncertainties. What would you do to honor the legacy of your ancestors? How would you balance the demands of the people with the needs of the kingdom? These were questions Rehoboam would soon have to answer, and his choices would change the course of history. But before we dive into that part of the story, let's reflect. How do you handle the expectations others place on you? Are you ready to assume the throne of your own life? With the death of Solomon, the weight of the crown fell upon Rehoboam's shoulders, and it was no ordinary weight. It was a burden of ruling a kingdom that, though glorious, was already showing signs of cracks. The United Kingdom of Israel, once a strong and cohesive nation, was beginning to fragment under the weight of the heavy tributes imposed by Solomon. The people, weary and overburdened, cried out for relief. Imagine this. You ascend the throne and, instead of celebrations and feasts, you're met with murmurs and demands. It was exactly the scenario Rehoboam had hoped for, but it was a reality he would have to face. The throne of Israel was not just a seat of power. It was a symbol of responsibility. Rehoboam, however, seemed more concerned with maintaining the pomp and wealth of the palace than with listening to the needs of the people. And here lies a valuable lesson. Leadership is not about display, but about service. How many of us, in our own lives, care more about appearances than substance? Are we willing to let go of our treasures to ease the burdens of others? The northern tribes, led by Jeroboam, were already showing signs of discontent. They wanted tax reductions and a fairer government. Rehoboam, however, seemed more interested in maintaining the status quo than in seeking solutions. And between us, how often do we also prefer comfort over change? It's easier to follow the same path than to forge new trails. But as Rehoboam would discover, the easier road isn't always the best one. At this crucial moment, Rehoboam had the opportunity to show wisdom and compassion. He could have followed in the footsteps of his father, Solomon, and sought a solution that would benefit everyone. But instead, he chose a harsher stance, influenced by advice that, as we'll see, wasn't the wisest. And this leads us to an important reflection. Who do you choose to listen to in moments of decision? Are the people around you helping you grow, or are they leading you down the wrong path? Meanwhile, tensions in the kingdom only grew. The people, who once saw the throne of Israel as a symbol of unity, began to question its legitimacy. Rehoboam, however, seemed more concerned with consolidating his power than seeking reconciliation. And as we all know, when leadership fails to listen, the people eventually find other ways to make themselves heard. But before we dive into this part of the story, let's reflect. How do you handle criticism and demands in your life? Are you willing to change for the better? Or do you prefer to stand firm in your positions, even if it means losing the support of those who depend on you? When the people gathered before Rehoboam to ask for relief from the heavy tributes, he found himself at a crossroads. On one side, the elders, experienced men who had served his father, Solomon, advised a gentle and conciliatory approach. On the other, his young friends, full of zeal and inexperience, suggested firmness and even severity. Imagine this. You're in Rehoboam's place, surrounded by voices pulling you in opposite directions. Which path should you take? The decision he would make would not only define his reign, but also the future of the United Kingdom of Israel. The elders, with the wisdom that only years can bring, recommended that Rehoboam ease the people's burden. They understood that a wise leader doesn't govern with authority alone, but also with compassion. After all, what good is an imposing throne if the people who sustain it are on the brink of collapse? This is a lesson many of us can take to heart. Leadership is about balance. Have you ever stopped to consider whether, in your decisions, you're thinking only about what's best for you or also about the impact they'll have on others? On the other hand, Rehoboam's young friends had a different perspective. They believed that showing strength and inflexibility was the best way to maintain control. If you give in now, the people will always want more, they said. And, in a way, this advice sounded tempting. Who hasn't felt the urge to impose their will, especially when under pressure? But, as Rehoboam would discover, strength without wisdom can be a double-edged sword. How often, in our own lives, Do we choose rigidity when flexibility would be the better solution? Rehoboam, however, chose to follow the advice of the young. He declared that he would not only maintain the heavy tributes, but increase them. "My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions," he said, in a phrase that will go down in history as an example of poor leadership. And here's an important reflection. How often in our lives do we choose an easier or more immediate path without considering the long-term consequences? Are we willing to pay the price for our impulsive decisions? Meanwhile, the people, already on the verge of revolt, saw Rehoboam's decision as the spark they needed. The northern tribes, led by Jeroboam, refused to accept his authority and proclaimed their independence. The United Kingdom of Israel, once a strong and cohesive nation, was about to split, and Rehoboam, who had inherited his father's throne, was about to discover that inheriting a kingdom is not the same as knowing how to govern it. But before we dive into this part of the story, let's reflect. How do you handle the advice you receive? Are you willing to listen to experienced voices? Or do you prefer to follow what seems easier in the moment? Rehoboam's decision to increase the tributes, following the advice of his young friends, was like pouring gasoline on an already burning fire. The people, already dissatisfied, erupted in revolt. The northern tribes, led by Jeroboam, refused to accept Rehoboam's authority and proclaimed their independence. Imagine this. In the blink of an eye, the United Kingdom of Israel, once a strong and cohesive nation, split in two, and all because Rehoboam chose rigidity over wisdom. How often in our own lives do we make impulsive decisions that end up causing more harm than good? The revolt wasn't just political, it was also emotional. The people who once saw the throne of Israel as a symbol of unity now saw it as a symbol of oppression. And Rehoboam, who was supposed to be the guardian of David and Solomon's legacy, became the one responsible for its fragmentation. And here lies an important lesson. Leadership isn't just about making decisions, but about understanding the impact of those decisions. Have you ever stopped to think about how your choices affect those around you? Are you willing to take responsibility for your actions, even when they don't turn out as planned? Meanwhile, Jeroboam, the new leader of the northern tribes, began consolidating his power. He established new centers of worship and encouraged idolatry, drawing the people away from Jerusalem and the temple built by Solomon. Rehoboam, however, seemed more concerned with maintaining control over what remained of his kingdom than seeking reconciliation. And between us, how often do we also cling to what we have, even when it's clear that change is needed? Does the fear of losing prevent us from gaining something greater? The division of the kingdom wasn't just a political event. It was also a spiritual one. The people who once worshiped God in unity were now divided in their faith. And Rehoboam, who was supposed to be the guardian of the spiritual heritage left by David and Solomon, allowed idolatry to spread. And here's an important reflection. How do you handle divisions in your life? Are you willing to seek reconciliation? Or do you prefer to stand firm in your positions, even if it means losing what's most important? Meanwhile, tensions between the North and the South only grew. Rehoboam, determined to restore his dominion, began gathering an army to march against the rebellious tribes. But, as we'll see, brute force isn't always the best solution. But before we dive into this part of the story, let's reflect. How do you handle conflicts in your life? Are you willing to seek peace? Or do you prefer to prepare for war? Determined to restore what he had lost, Rehoboam gathered a large army to march against the rebellious tribes of the north. He was ready to fight, to show that the throne of Israel was still powerful, even if divided. But sometimes, brute force isn't the right answer, and Rehoboam was about to learn this in a way that would change his reign forever. Imagine this. You're in command of an army with a chance to reclaim what you've lost, but something inside you says there might be a better way. What would you do? Would you trust in your own strength or seek greater guidance? In the midst of preparations for battle, a prophet of God appeared to Rehoboam with a clear message. Do not march against your brothers. Return home, for this division has come for me. It was a direct warning, a chance to avoid further bloodshed and seek a peaceful solution. But Between us, how often do we also ignore the warnings we receive, whether from others or from our own conscience? Are we willing to stop, reflect, and change course? Or do we prefer to press on, even knowing the path is wrong? To his credit, Rehoboam decided to listen to the prophet and called off the march. It was a rare moment of humility in a reign marked by impulsive decisions. And here lies a valuable lesson. Victory isn't always in fighting, but in knowing when to retreat. How often, in our own lives, do we insist on battles we don't need to fight? Are we willing to recognize that sometimes true strength lies in knowing when to yield? However, even with this correct decision, Rehoboam didn't seize the opportunity to seek genuine reconciliation with the northern tribes. He returned to Jerusalem, but did nothing to repair the broken relationships. And between us, how often do we also let opportunities to fix what's wrong slip by? Are we willing to take the first step toward reconciliation? Or do we prefer to keep our distance, hoping time will resolve everything? Meanwhile, the kingdom remained divided, and tensions between the north and the south persisted. Rehoboam, who could have been an agent of unity, ended up becoming a symbol of division. And here's an important reflection. How do you handle opportunities to change the course of things? Are you willing to act while there's still time, or do you prefer to wait until it's too late? But before we dive into this part of the story, let's reflect. How do you handle the warnings you receive in your life? Are you willing to stop, reflect, and change course? Or do you prefer to press on, even knowing the path is wrong? After the division of the kingdom, Rehoboam turned his attention to strengthening what remained of his domain, the kingdom of Judah, with Jerusalem as its capital. However, instead of seeking reconciliation with the northern tribes or strengthening the people's faith in God, he opted for a purely human strategy. He fortified cities, stockpiled weapons, and prepared for potential conflicts. Imagine this. You have a chance to rebuild something broken, but instead of repairing relationships, you build walls. Does that really solve the problem? Or does it just delay the inevitable? While Rehoboam focused on the physical defenses of the kingdom, the people's spirituality went from bad to worse. Idolatry, which was already a problem in the north, began to infiltrate Judah. Rehoboam, who was supposed to be the guardian of the spiritual heritage left by David and Solomon, allowed pagan practices to spread. And here lies an important lesson. It's no use strengthening the walls if the foundation is weak. How often, in our own lives, do we focus on protecting the exterior while neglecting what's inside? Are we willing to care for our spiritual house with the same dedication we give to our physical home? Spiritual instability brought with it political instability. The people who once saw the throne of Israel as a symbol of stability now saw Rehoboam as a weak and indecisive leader. And between us, how often do we also lose the trust of those who depend on us because we aren't firm in our values? Are we willing to recognize that true strength comes from within, not from external appearances? Meanwhile, internal disputes within the palace only grew. Rehoboam, who already struggled to govern the kingdom, now had to deal with rivalries among his own family members. His son Abijah, whom he was preparing for the throne, was viewed with suspicion by other members of the royal family. And here's an important reflection. How do you handle conflicts within your own house? Are you willing to address tensions head-on, or do you prefer to ignore them, hoping they'll resolve themselves? Amid all this, Rehoboam seemed more concerned with maintaining his authority than seeking the well-being of the people. He allowed idolatry to spread, internal disputes to grow, and the kingdom to weaken even further. And, as we all know, a kingdom divided against itself cannot stand. But before we dive into this part of the story, let's reflect. How do you handle weaknesses in your life? Are you willing to recognize your flaws and seek help? Or do you prefer to stand firm, even knowing you're on the wrong path? In the 5th year of his reign, Rehoboam faced one of the greatest challenges of his leadership, the invasion of Egypt led by Pharaoh Shishak. The Egyptian army marched into Judah, plundering Jerusalem and taking with them the treasures of the temple and Rehoboam's palace. Imagine this. You spend years accumulating wealth, fortifying cities, and preparing for conflicts, and suddenly everything is taken in an instant. Was all that preparation worth it? Or was Rehoboam focused on the wrong things? The invasion was a devastating blow to the kingdom of Judah. The treasures that Solomon had accumulated over his reign, symbols of Israel's glory and wisdom, were carried off as spoils of war. And here lies an important lesson. It's no use accumulating wealth if you're not prepared to protect what truly matters. How often, in our own lives, do we focus on accumulating material possessions while neglecting our health, relationships, and spirituality? Are we willing to rethink our priorities before it's too late? In the midst of the crisis, Rehoboam finally humbled himself before God. He recognized that all his strength and preparation were not enough to protect the kingdom, and that only God could save him from total destruction. And between us, how often do we also need to hit rock bottom to realize we need help? Are we willing to humble our hearts and seek divine guidance? Or do we prefer to rely solely on our own strength? Despite his humility, Rehoboam couldn't completely avoid the consequences of his actions. The kingdom of Judah remained under Egyptian domination, and Shishak's influence continued to be felt for many years. And here's an important reflection. How do you handle the consequences of your choices? Are you willing to face the difficulties that arise as a result of your decisions? Or do you prefer to blame others for what went wrong? Meanwhile, the people of Judah, already weakened by the division of the kingdom and idolatry, now had to deal with foreign occupation. Rehoboam, who was supposed to be protector of the people, found himself powerless in the face of the invasion. And, as we all know, true leadership is tested in times of crisis. But before we dive into this part of the story, let's reflect. How do you handle crises in your life? Are you willing to seek help and guidance? Or do you prefer to face everything alone, even knowing you won't succeed? Even after the Egyptian invasion and Rehoboam's humiliation, the kingdom of Judah continued to waver between periods of repentance and idolatry. It was a vicious cycle. The people would turn away from God, face disastrous consequences, repent, and for a time, return to faith. But soon after, they would fall back into the same mistakes. Imagine this. You see a pattern repeating in your life, but even knowing it's wrong, you keep falling into the same trap. Are you willing to break that cycle, or do you prefer to remain stuck in it? Rehoboam, as a leader, had the opportunity to guide the people back to God consistently. However, he himself was trapped in this cycle of unfaithfulness. He allowed idolatry to continue spreading, even after the Egyptian invasion had shown the consequences of turning away from God. And here lies an important lesson. Leadership isn't just about making the right decisions at the right time, but about maintaining consistency over time. How often in our own lives do we start something with good intentions, but end up straying from path? Are we willing to commit to consistency, even when it's hard? Meanwhile, internal disputes within the palace continue to undermine the kingdom's stability. Rehoboam, who already struggled to govern, now had to deal with rivalry among his own sons, especially Abijah, whom he was preparing for the throne. And between us, how often do we also allow internal conflicts to distract us from what truly matters? Are we willing to address these issues head-on, or do we prefer to ignore them, hoping they'll resolve themselves? The unfaithfulness of Rehoboam and the people of Judah wasn't just a spiritual issue. It was also a political one. A kingdom that isn't firm in its values and beliefs can hardly remain strong in the face of external threats. And here's an important reflection. How do you handle unfaithfulness in your life? Are you willing to recognize your mistakes and seek change? Or do you prefer to stay in the same cycle, hoping things will improve on their own? Meanwhile, Rehoboam's legacy continued to erode. He, who had inherited a strong and united kingdom from Solomon, was leaving behind a weak and divided kingdom for his successors. And, as we all know, true legacy isn't about what we leave behind, but the impact we have on the lives of those around us. But before we dive into this part of the story, let's reflect. How do you handle vicious cycles in your life? Are you willing to break those patterns, or do you prefer to remain stuck in them, hoping something will change? Within Rehoboam's palace, internal disputes weren't just political. They were also familial. Rehoboam, who was already struggling to govern a divided kingdom, now had to deal with rivalries among his own sons. Abijah, his eldest son and apparent heir to the throne of Israel, was viewed with suspicion by other members of the royal family. Imagine this. You're trying to keep a kingdom united, but your own house is divided. Is it even possible to lead effectively when there's so much conflict close to home? Rehoboam, however, seemed more interested in consolidating Abijah's power than in resolving the family tensions. He prepared Abijah for the throne, but did little to ensure the unity of the family. And here lies an important lesson. Leadership isn't just about preparing successors, but about ensuring everyone is aligned with a common purpose. How often, in our own lives, do we focus on preparing for the future while neglecting the present? Are we willing to invest in relationships today to ensure a better tomorrow? The internal disputes within the palace reflected the larger divisions that had already fragmented the united kingdom of Israel. While Rehoboam was busy strengthening Abijah's position, he allowed rivalries and intrigues to undermine the kingdom's stability. And between us, how often do we also let small conflicts grow into big problems? Are we willing to address these issues head-on, or do we prefer to ignore them, hoping they'll resolve themselves? Meanwhile, Abijah, who was being groomed for the throne, grew up in an environment of competition and mistrust. He saw his brothers as rivals, not allies. And here's an important reflection. How do you handle rivalries within your own family? Are you willing to promote unity? Or do you prefer to fuel divisions, hoping time will sort everything out? Amid all this, Rehoboam seemed more concerned with securing the future of the throne than with resolving the issues undermining the present. He allowed the internal disputes to continue, and this only increased the kingdom's instability. And, as we all know, a kingdom divided against itself cannot stand. But before we dive into this part of the story, let's reflect. How do you handle conflict within your own house? Are you willing to face tensions head-on, or do you prefer to ignore them, hoping they'll resolve themselves? Rehoboam ruled Judah for 17 years, but his reign left a legacy marked by division, instability, and spiritual unfaithfulness. He, who inherited a united and prosperous kingdom from his father, Solomon, ended his rule with a fractured and weakened kingdom. Imagine this. You receive a valuable inheritance, but due to poor decisions and a lack of wisdom, you end up losing everything. Is the legacy we're building today something that will be worth remembering in the future? The throne of Israel, once a symbol of unity and strength, became a symbol of division and weakness under Rehoboam's rule. He allowed internal disputes, idolatry, and family rivalries to undermine the kingdom's stability. And here lies an important lesson. True legacy isn't measured by the power or wealth we accumulate, but by the impact we have on the lives of those around us. How often, in our own lives, do we focus on accumulating material possessions while neglecting our relationships and spiritual values? Are we willing to rethink our priorities before it's too late? The wisdom of Solomon, which could have been Rehoboam's guide, was replaced by impulsive decisions and misguided advice. He chose to listen to the young instead of the elders, opted for rigidity over compassion, and preferred brute force over wisdom. And between us, how often do we also make decisions based on impulses rather than seeking guidance and reflection? Are we willing to learn from Rehoboam's mistakes and seek wisdom in our own lives? Meanwhile, the people of Judah, who once lived in unity and prosperity, now face divisions, invasions, and spiritual instability. Rehoboam, who was supposed to be the guardian of the royal legacy left by David and Solomon, ended up becoming an example of how pride and a lack of wisdom can lead to ruin. And here's an important reflection. How do you handle opportunities to change the course of things? Are you willing to act while there's still time, or do you prefer to wait until it's too late? In the end, Rehoboam's reign serves as a powerful reminder of the dangers of pride, impulsiveness, and spiritual unfaithfulness. It shows us that inheriting a legacy is not the same as knowing how to maintain it, and that true leadership requires wisdom, humility, and a commitment to the well-being of others. But before we conclude this journey, let's reflect. What is the legacy you're building? Will it be something worth remembering in the future, or will it be forgotten with time? So, what can we learn from the story of Rehoboam, the king who divided Israel? Are his impulsive choices and lack of wisdom just mistakes of the past, or do they reflect challenges we still face today? The truth is, Rehoboam's story isn't just a biblical account. It's an invitation to reflect on how we handle power, responsibilities, and the decisions that shape our lives. And the big question is, are you willing to learn from his mistakes so you don't repeat them? Think about the decisions you've been making lately. Have you been seeking wise counsel, or have you chosen to listen only to what confirms your desires? Have you acted with humility and compassion, or has pride guided your actions? Rehoboam shows us that a single impulsive decision can have devastating consequences. But he also shows us that there's always a chance to change course, to seek reconciliation, and to rebuild what's been broken. What about you? What are you willing to rebuild in your life? Now, imagine the impact your choices have on the lives of those around you, whether at work, in your family, or in your community. Every decision you make influences the world in some way. Are you building bridges or raising walls? Are you promoting unity or fueling division? Rehoboam's story reminds us that true legacy isn't measured by the power we accumulate, but by the good we do for others. What kind of legacy do you want to leave? Finally, I want to challenge you to act. It's not enough to just reflect on these lessons. You need to put them into practice. How about starting today? Seek wise counsel, listen more than you speak, and be willing to change course when necessary. And if you want to keep learning how to make decisions that transform lives, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. That way, you'll never miss any of these powerful lessons that can change the course of your story. So, are you ready to write a new chapter in your life? What will you do differently starting today? Share in the comments, and let's build a legacy worth remembering together.